The air was thick, a raw wound of cold and dampness clinging to the lungs. Each gasp was a shallow scrape, tearing at a throat already raw with fear. Bare feet slapped against slick, uneven stone, the rhythm of flight a frantic, desperate pulse against the thrumming silence of the night. A sliver of moon, a cruel, indifferent crescent, offered just enough light to paint the shadows with monstrous shifting forms. Her breath plumed in the frigid air, ghost-like and ephemeral, a fleeting testament to a life she was trying to reclaim. The scent of stale urine and rotting refuse, the everyday perfume of confinement, still clung to her clothes, a phantom chain. Her muscles screamed, a searing protest against the unfamiliar exertion. But the alternative was a paralysis of spirit far worse than any physical pain. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog's bark became a hunter's footfall, a shadow stretching to encompass her fragile hope. The sheer audacity of her act, the defiance against an unyielding world, gave her a fleeting, dangerous strength. She pushed deeper into the labyrinthine darkness, a small, defiant tremor against the vast, crushing weight of an empire. The chill seeped into her bones, not just from the biting wind, but from the cold grip of what lay behind. She imagined the heavy thud of sandals on the cobblestones, the guttural shouts, the leashes straining in the hands of men whose faces were carved from stone. The image spurred her on, a cruel whip against her flagging will. Her eyes darted, searching for any break in the oppressive gloom, any sign of refuge in this indifferent world. The city, a sleeping behemoth, stretched out behind her, its silent buildings holding a million watchful eyes. To escape its grasp felt impossible, a dream woven from desperation. The only warmth came from the burning in her chest, the desperate furnace of survival. But then a sound, distinct and chilling, cut through the night's muffled blanket, the sharp crack of a whip, followed by a distant, mournful cry. It wasn't for her, not yet, but it was a stark reminder, a cold hand closing around her fleeting breath of freedom. The ground gave way beneath her, a sudden, jarring stumble, and for a moment the world tilted, a dizzying spiral into inevitable capture. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. She hit the earth with a gasp, the impact jarring her teeth and sending a fresh wave of agony through her already aching body. For a split second, the world was a confused blur of pain and panic. Her hands scrabbled, finding purchase on rough earth and tangled roots, pushing herself up with a desperate urgency. The crack of the whip echoed again, closer this time, a cold, sharp sound that sliced through the night. The scent of wet earth and ancient stone filled her nostrils, grounding her momentarily in the brutal reality of her situation. This wasn't merely a flight for survival, it was a desperate gamble against an entire system, a defiance of laws etched in blood and iron. In Rome, the concept of a runaway slave, particularly a woman, was met with an unyielding brutality that chills the modern mind. Our perception of freedom, an inherent right, would have been incomprehensible, even ludicrous, to the masters of the Roman world. For them, a slave was property, a living tool, and property that dared to escape was property that needed to be broken, visibly, undeniably, to serve as a terrorizing example for all others who might harbour similar dangerous thoughts. The very thought of escape was a threat to the carefully constructed order of their society, a challenge to the gods themselves who, they believed, sanctioned their dominion. The air grew heavier with the presence of her pursuers, the distinct scent of their leather and sweat reaching her now. She could feel their eyes, unseen but palpable, tracing her path in the inky blackness. This desperate scramble for liberty was not merely a crime against an owner. It was an affront to the very fabric of Roman society, a betrayal of the order that sustained their empire. A woman, often seen as inherently weaker, more emotional and less capable of calculated defiance, was expected to remain compliant. Her escape was therefore an even greater transgression, challenging not only her master's authority, but also deeply ingrained societal expectations about female obedience. The psychological impact of a woman breaking free from such a rigid social and legal structure resonated deeply within the Roman consciousness. It wasn't just about recovering lost property. It was about reasserting control, demonstrating the futility of resistance, and reinforcing the brutal hierarchy that underpinned their prosperity. Her punishment would serve a dual purpose: to reclaim her body and to crush the spirit of any other woman who dared to dream of a life beyond the chains. The ground beneath her feet was becoming more treacherous, indicating a departure from the city's immediate surroundings. Perhaps a path to the wilderness, a wild, untamed land that offered a different kind of danger, but also a sliver of hope. Yet the sounds of pursuit were closer still, the guttural barks of the dogs now piercing the night, growing louder with each frantic beat of her heart. She could almost taste their hot breath, feel their snapping jaws. The thought of being dragged back, humiliated and broken, fueled a last surge of desperate energy. Her breath tore in her chest, a ragged, burning sound. The contrast with our own world, where the very idea of a human being owned, bought and sold is abhorrent, creates a stark, almost unbridgeable chasm of understanding. We speak of human rights, of freedom as an inalienable truth. But in ancient Rome, such concepts were luxuries reserved for a select few, and for the enslaved, the world was a cage with invisible yet unbreakable bars. The fear she felt was a primal terror, stripped of any societal cushioning, a raw, visceral understanding of what it meant to be utterly devoid of agency. The shadows ahead began to thin, hinting at the approach of dawn, a faint metallic grey bleeding into the eastern sky. This was both a blessing and a curse. Light offered visibility, but also exposure. Her escape had been under the cloak of darkness, a silent plea to the night. Now the encroaching day threatened to reveal her, stark against the emerging landscape. The sheer scale of Roman slavery is difficult to grasp. Millions of people captured in war, born into bondage or sold for debt, formed the backbone of an empire. Women especially faced a unique set of vulnerabilities and roles within this system, from domestic servants and weavers to agricultural labourers and sex workers. Their bodies, their labour, and their very existence were subject to the absolute will of their masters. This pervasive system meant that escape for any slave was an act of profound courage and desperate futility. For a woman, the stakes were often even higher, laden with the additional dangers of sexual exploitation and the crushing social stigma that accompanied a life outside the established norms. The scent of pine and damp earth grew stronger, a fleeting comfort amidst the growing dread. A sudden glint of metal, a fleeting shimmer in the pre-dawn gloom caught her eye. Not the city's edge, but a patrol, perhaps. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A wild bird trapped in a cage. She plunged sideways into a dense thicket of thorns and clinging vines, tearing at her skin, but offering a momentary screen. The sharp sting of the thorns was a welcome pain, a distraction from the larger terror. She pressed herself against the cold, rough bark of a tree, holding her breath, listening to the world outside her thorny prison. The barks of the dogs were now very close, followed by the heavy thud of men's boots. She could hear their frustrated grunts, their low, guttural curses. The air crackled with their impatience, their relentless determination to reclaim what was theirs. The silence that followed, after a moment of intense scrutiny, was almost worse than the noise, an agonizing stretch of uncertainty. She imagined their calculating eyes scanning the shadows, missing nothing. It was a cruel game of hide and seek, with her freedom, her very life, as the ultimate prize. The chill of the pre-dawn air intensified, a shiver running through her, not entirely from the cold. The scent of the hunting dogs, sharp and musky, was now overwhelming, an invisible noose tightening around her. She closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her face into the rough bark, trying to conjure an image of a world beyond this, a place where the sun shone without the threat of a master's shadow. The mental contrast with our contemporary lives, where even the most disadvantaged among us possess a basic autonomy and expectation of legal protection, highlights the utter desolation of her existence. Her body was not her own. Her will, her hopes, her dreams were considered mere delusions. This was the fundamental truth of Roman slavery, a person reduced to an object, a vessel for another's desires. The silence of the pursuers broke, a sudden triumphant shout echoing through the trees, followed by the crashing of bodies through the undergrowth. Her heart leaped, a frantic, futile beat against the inevitable. The thorns, her fleeting shield, were no match for their brute force. The game was over. A rough hand seized her arm, yanking her from the thicket with brutal force. The thorns tore at her skin, but the pain was distant, secondary to the crushing weight of defeat. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the damp earth, the chill seeping into her joints. Above her, silhouetted against the nascent grey of dawn, stood two figures, their faces grim, their eyes hard and devoid of pity. The dogs, panting heavily, circled her, their low growls a guttural song of triumph. This was the moment the fragile illusion of freedom shattered, dissolving into the harsh reality of capture. The scent of their unwashed bodies, mixed with the metallic tang of fear, filled her senses. She didn't fight, not anymore. The fight had left her body, leaving only a hollow ache where hope had briefly resided. They dragged her up roughly, the calloused hands burning against her skin. The future stretched before her, a dark, featureless expanse of renewed servitude, but with a terrifying addition, the certainty of retribution. She knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that her escape had sealed her fate, marking her for a punishment designed not just to hurt, but to obliterate the very will to dream of liberty again. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the distant outline of the city, its familiar structures now looming like a monstrous, inescapable prison. Each step back towards it was a descent into a deeper despair. The guard's grip tightened, a bruising reminder of her utter powerlessness. The concept of justice, as we understand it, was entirely absent from her reality. Her crime was daring to assert her humanity, an act deemed unforgivable in the rigid social order of Rome. The quiet despair that settled upon her was profound, a heavy shroud woven from the realization that her suffering was not just personal, but systemic, an integral part of the machinery of her empire. The very air seemed to press down on her, robbing her of breath. The coldness she felt now was not merely the morning chill, but the frigid touch of a world that saw her as property, a tool, a mere commodity whose value was diminished by her attempted flight. This brokenness, this spiritual fracturing was often the first, most insidious punishment, preceding any physical torment. They led her onward, her bare feet dragging, each step a testament to a hope extinguished. The journey back was a blur of aching muscles and silent humiliation. She was bound, her wrists chafed raw by coarse rope, marched through the waking city as a spectacle. The early morning street vendors, the hurried slaves, the occasional citizen on their way to business, all turned their heads, their gazes a mixture of curiosity, pity, and often cold indifference. She felt their eyes like pinpricks on her skin, each one reinforcing her shame. Her head was bowed, her hair matted with dirt and sweat, shielding her from their stares, a small act of defiance in her utter defeat. The smells of the city, once a faint memory of a life she'd known, now assaulted her. Burning charcoal, ripe fruit, human waste, incense from a nearby temple. They were the smells of a living, breathing world from which she was utterly severed. The sheer loneliness of her situation was a crushing weight. She was an island of despair in a bustling sea of life. She heard whispers, fragments of conversation, enough to know her fate was being discussed, judged, cemented in the minds of strangers. The weight of their judgment was almost as heavy as the ropes that bound her. The rhythmic thud of their footsteps echoed in the narrow streets, a relentless drumbeat marking her inevitable return to bondage. The sun, now fully risen, beat down with a harsh, unforgiving light, exposing every flaw, every tear in her tunic, every streak of dirt on her skin. There was no hiding now. The vibrant colours of the city, the painted frescoes, the rich robes of the wealthy, the bright wares in the shops, seemed to mock her drab, defeated state. She passed by a fountain, its cool water splashing playfully, and a sudden, sharp pang of thirst tightened her throat. The simplest comforts, the most basic human needs, felt like distant dreams, unattainable luxuries. Her mind, in a desperate attempt to find solace, drifted to the soft touch of moss, the whisper of wind through leaves she'd felt during her brief flight. These fleeting memories were quickly overtaken by the stark reality of her imminent punishment. She knew the Roman system well enough to understand that her attempted escape, as a female slave, would be met with a severity designed not just to punish, but to utterly obliterate her spirit, to ensure she would never again dare to dream of freedom. The air was thick with the dust of the city, each particle a tiny witness to her despair. They led her not to her old master's house, but to a public square where a crowd was already gathering, drawn by the commotion. A makeshift platform, crudely constructed, stood in the centre, stark and ominous. Her heart seized in her chest. This was not merely a return, this was a spectacle, a public lesson. The first brutal punishment awaited her, public humiliation and branding. The crowd's murmur rose and fell, a restless, curious beast. Some faces were grim, others merely indifferent. A few held a flicker of grim satisfaction. To be stripped of one's dignity, to be made an object of scorn and warning, was a profound act of dehumanization. It was a calculated assault not just on the body, but on the very soul. The sunlight, once a symbol of revealing truth, now felt like a spotlight, magnifying her shame. The air tasted metallic, a premonition of pain. This wasn't merely a consequence for a misdeed, it was an act designed to sever her entirely from her past self, to reforge her identity as a broken, branded thing, forever marked by her transgression. The scent of sweat and fear mingled with the dusty air. The rough hands of the guards pushed her onto the platform. The wooden planks beneath her bare feet were splintered and unyielding, cold to the touch. A hushed silence fell over the crowd, a momentary intake of breath before the inevitable. She heard the clink of metal, the hiss of a brazier. Her eyes, wide with terror, saw the glowing iron, its tip a fiery orange against the pale morning sky. The heat radiated outwards, a chilling premonition. This act of branding, a permanent disfigurement, served multiple purposes in the Roman world. It was a clear marker for other slave owners, identifying a runaway instantly. But more profoundly, it was a symbolic act of ownership, an inscription of power onto her flesh. It stripped away any remaining pretense of individuality, reducing her to a piece of property indelibly marked. The shame of it would be a constant companion, a burning reminder visible to all who saw her. It was a punishment that continued long after the initial pain subsided, a scar on her identity, a wound in her spirit that would never truly heal. She closed her eyes, bracing for the searing agony. A silent scream caught in her throat. The pain was instantaneous and absolute, a searing white-hot agony that ripped through her, stealing her breath. A primal scream tore from her throat, raw and involuntary, echoing in the sudden shocked silence of the crowd. The smell of burning flesh, acrid and sickening, filled the air. Her body convulsed, a desperate animalistic struggle against the restraints that held her fast. Tears streamed down her face, not just from the excruciating physical pain, but from the profound violation, the absolute annihilation of herself. The brand, a single letter perhaps, or a symbol, was burned deep into her skin, a permanent declaration of her status as a runaway, a defiant mark etched in suffering. This was a visible, inescapable tether to her past transgression, a constant reminder of the futility of resistance. The searing heat lingered, a phantom limb of agony, long after the iron was removed. Her muscles trembled, her vision swam, and the world seemed to shrink to this single point of unbearable torment. This was the first lesson in the harsh curriculum of Roman punishment, that freedom was not merely denied, but physically scourged from the very flesh of those who dared to seek it. As the initial shock of the branding subsided, a deep hollow ache settled in its place, a throbbing pulse of despair. The crowd, now buzzing with renewed chatter, began to disperse, the spectacle concluded. For them, it was a momentary diversion, a cautionary tale. For her, it was a new beginning in a life defined by pain. They unbound her, and she collapsed, weak-kneed, the burning mark on her skin, a heavy, constant weight. The guards, their faces impassive, roughly pulled her to her feet. The public spectacle of her humiliation was over, but the punishment was far from concluded. This visible scar, forever marking her as fugitiva, a runaway, would follow her, a silent pronouncement of her shame to every stranger she encountered. It meant worse treatment, more suspicion, and often the most arduous tasks. The very air around her felt different now, imbued with the bitter taste of public degradation. She was not just a slave, but a marked slave, a living billboard of an empire's power. The sun, once a harbinger of hope, now felt like a searing eye, casting judgment on her branded skin. From the public square she was not returned to her previous home. Instead, she was taken to a grim, foreboding compound on the outskirts of the city. This was a new level of servitude, a deeper descent into the hell of Roman punishment. Forced labour in the worst conditions. The gates were heavy, iron-bound, clanging shut behind her with a sound of finality that echoed in her soul. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of sweat, dust, and human suffering. This was a mill, a place where grain was ground day and night, powered by the sheer, unyielding force of enslaved bodies. The rhythmic groan of the heavy millstones, the shuffle of feet, the low, monotonous chants of the workers, it was a symphony of despair. Her eyes scanned the faces of the other women, hollowed by exhaustion, etched with a resignation that chilled her to the bone. Here the work was relentless, the supervision brutal, and the hope of escape even more remote. The brand on her skin felt like a personal condemnation in this place, a scarlet letter confirming her unreliability. Her hands, already raw from her flight, would soon be blistered and calloused from the rough handles of the mill. The weight of the millstones, the constant, arduous turning, would break her body faster than any whip. Food would be sparse, sleep a fleeting luxury, and rest a distant dream. This form of punishment was a slow, agonizing death, a systematic erosion of the human spirit through sheer physical depletion. Unlike the branding, which was an acute public agony, this was a chronic, private suffering, grinding away at the edges of her existence day by monotonous day. The only sound in her mind would be the ceaseless grating rumble of the mill, a constant reminder of her inescapable fate. The freedom of movement, the simple act of walking where one chose, which we take for granted, was here replaced by an enforced repetitive motion, a grotesque dance of despair. Her muscles, already protesting from the journey, quivered at the thought of the endless labour. The faint memory of the wind in her hair, of the open sky, now felt like a cruel joke in this stifling, dusty enclosure. Days blurred into weeks, marked only by the shifting light through the high, barred windows and the unrelenting ache in her limbs. Her hands became raw, then calloused, then numb to the constant friction of the mill. Her shoulders rounded with the strain, her back a perpetual knot of pain. The coarse food offered little sustenance against the prodigious energy expended. She felt herself wasting away, her flesh receding, her bones becoming more prominent, a living skeleton animated by a fading will. The only relief came in the fleeting moments of exhausted sleep, where fragmented dreams of open fields and clean water flickered, only to be cruelly snatched away by the harsh dawn and the clang of the overseer's bell. The overseers themselves were often brutal, enforcing the relentless pace with whips and curses, their faces hard and unforgiving, seeing only bodies to be driven, not individuals to be cared for. This was the second brutal punishment, a prolonged physical and spiritual torment, designed to crush any remnants of defiance. The dust from the grinding grain permeated everything, coating her lungs, making each breath a gritty effort, a constant taste of her bitter reality. The very air she breathed was heavy with the fine, choking dust of the grain, settling on her skin, clinging to her hair, making her cough with a dry, rasping sound. Her voice, once soft, became hoarse from the dust and disuse. Conversation among the slaves was minimal, hushed whispers of despair or warnings of surveillance. The constant drone of the millstones became a part of her, a ceaseless hum in her bones, deafening her to any internal protest. The light from the small, high windows seemed to mock her, offering glimpses of a sky she could not touch, a world she was no longer part of. Her sense of self was slowly eroding, replaced by the identity of a labourer, a cog in a grinding machine. The irony was bitter. The very food that sustained the empire was produced by the destruction of human bodies, ground down much like the grain itself. The contrast with our modern understanding of labour rights, of regulated hours and safe conditions, is staggering, highlighting the utter disregard for human life that permeated this system. She would wake each morning with a groan, her body a testament to the night's brief, insufficient rest, facing another endless cycle of toil under the unforgiving Roman sun. Yet, even in the depths of this despair, a flicker, a tiny ember of defiance sometimes sparked. Perhaps it was the shared glance with another woman, a silent acknowledgement of mutual suffering, or the brief, almost imperceptible slowing of the millstone when the overseer's back was turned. These were not acts of grand rebellion, but minute assertions of individuality, whispers of a spirit refusing to be entirely extinguished. But such whispers were dangerous. The Roman system was designed to detect and brutally suppress even the faintest glimmer of renewed hope, especially in a recaptured runaway. Her previous escape attempt marked her, making her a target for closer scrutiny and harsher treatment. The masters knew that if one broken woman could still harbour such thoughts, then the example of her punishment hadn't been severe enough. The dust and the drone of the mill were her constant companions, but the subtle awareness of the other women, their shared unspoken agony, formed a fragile, invisible bond. This unspoken solidarity was a dangerous comfort, a silent promise of defiance even in the face of absolute despair. The grinding motion, once a torment, became a numb rhythm, a part of her decaying existence. One day, a new face arrived. Another woman, younger, her eyes still holding a spark of fire not yet extinguished. She too bore the mark of a runaway, though hers was on her cheek a stark, angry brand. A silent understanding passed between them, a shared history of defiance and capture. This shared pain, however, was a double-edged sword. While it fostered a fleeting sense of connection, it also highlighted the brutal effectiveness of the Roman system. Each new face was a testament to the empire's power, a grim confirmation that no matter how many escaped, they would always be brought back, broken, and thrown into the same grinder. The air in the mill grew thicker with the added presence of yet another defeated soul. The new woman's arrival served as a stark, chilling reminder of the cyclical nature of their fate, a desperate flight, a brutal recapture, and a life sentence to a fate worse than death. The monotony of the mill was briefly broken by this new presence, a pause in the endless cycle of suffering, but the inevitable return to the grind was swift and unforgiving. The metallic tang of fear, a familiar scent mingled with the dust and sweat. The whispers of a new, even harsher fate began to circulate among the mill slaves, carried on the dusty air like a contagious disease. Stories of women, repeat offenders, or those deemed particularly rebellious being sold off to the mines. The word mines hung in the air like a death sentence. It was a place of eternal darkness, of back-breaking labour deep beneath the earth, where the sun never touched, and life was measured in days, sometimes hours, before collapse. This was the third brutal punishment, a descent into an underground hell, a fate almost universally dreaded. The thought of it sent a shiver through her already exhausted body. Here, in the mill, at least there was light, however meagre, and the open sky, however distant. The mines promised only endless gloom, choking dust, and the constant threat of cave-ins. It was a place where bodies were consumed by the earth, where hope died a slow, suffocating death. The air in the mill felt suddenly heavier, the grind of the stones more ominous, as if echoing the groans from beneath the earth. The fear was palpable, a cold hand squeezing her heart. The overseer's eyes, always watchful, seemed to linger on her, more often after the new woman arrived. Her previous escape, her brand, combined with this subtle, unspoken connection to the newer, still fiery spirit, made her a prime candidate for the next stage of a Roman retribution. One brutal morning, the order came, her name was called, and the grinding mill fell silent for a terrifying moment. She knew. The other women averted their gazes, a mixture of fear and profound, helpless pity in their eyes. There were no goodbyes, no farewells, only the grim procession out of the mill, her branded arm grabbed by a hardened guard. She looked back once, her eyes meeting the new woman's, a silent message of resignation and despair passing between them. The gates of the mill clanged shut behind her, but this time the sound was not one of return but of further descent. She was being sent to a deeper, darker oblivion, a place where the sun was merely a memory, and the earth itself became a tomb. The air outside felt strangely thin, as if she were already being pulled into the crushing weight of the subterranean world. The journey to the mines was long and arduous, a slow procession into a barren, desolate landscape. The cart jostled over rough roads, its wooden wheels groaning under the weight of its human cargo. She was huddled with other women, all bearing the marks of their transgressions, their faces gaunt and resigned. The air grew colder, thinner, filled with the metallic scent of ore and the pervasive stench of sweat and despair. As they approached, the mines loomed on the horizon, gaping mouths in the side of a mountain, exhaling a chill, dusty breath. It was a landscape of stark, raw earth, scarred by human toil, a monument to human suffering. This was a place where life was cheap, where the earth took its tribute of bodies and souls. The sounds that carried on the wind were chilling, the dull thud of picks, the distant rumble of collapsing rock, and the mournful cries of those trapped below. The sight of the entrance, a dark maw swallowing humanity, filled her with a profound, terrifying dread. This was the Empire's ultimate solution for the intractable, for those who dared to defy its absolute power, bury them alive in the service of its insatiable needs. As they drew closer, the scale of the operation became terrifyingly clear. Hundreds of figures, like ants, moved across the scarred landscape, dragging baskets of rock, their bodies bent and broken. The air was thick with dust, coating everything in a fine grey film. The guards here were even more brutal, their faces hardened by the constant proximity to death and despair, their whips never idle. The very light of the sun seemed to dim as they approached the mine entrance, swallowed by the shadow of the mountains. Inside, she knew, lay eternal twilight, the constant threat of suffocation and the gnawing fear of collapse. The thought of never seeing the sun again, of spending her remaining days in the cold, damp darkness, was a torment more profound than any physical pain. This was a punishment designed not just to exploit labour, but to utterly extinguish hope, to remove the fugitiva from the light of the living world. The metallic taste of fear was strong in her mouth, a grim companion on this final descent into the earth's unforgiving embrace. Inside the mine, the darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed in on all sides. The only illumination came from flickering oil lamps casting grotesque, dancing shadows that made the cramped tunnels seem to writhe. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, sweat, and human waste, each breath a struggle against the oppressive dust. The sounds were horrifying, the incessant clang of picks against rock, the scraping of shovels, the low groans of men and women, and the unsettling creak of timbers barely holding back the mountain. She was given a heavy pickaxe, its handle rough against her already raw hands, and pushed into a narrow vein. Her body, already weakened by the mill, protested instantly. Each swing of the pick sent shockwaves of pain through her arms and shoulders, the rock stubbornly resisting her efforts. This was not work. It was a slow, deliberate form of self-annihilation, chipping away at the earth and at her own life force. The concept of freedom, once a burning ember, was now a distant mocking echo in the cold, unyielding darkness. The damp chill of the mine seeped into her bones, a constant, pervasive cold that no amount of exertion could banish. Water trickled down the rough-hewn walls, forming muddy puddles underfoot, making the footing treacherous. The overseers, shadowy figures in the dim light, moved with a predatory grace, their whips cracking frequently, urging on the flagging workers. There was no respite, no moment of peace. The shifts were endless, blurring into an indistinguishable cycle of labour and exhaustion. Her back ached, her lungs burned, and her hands were a mess of blisters and torn skin. She longed for the simple ache of the mill, for the distant glimpse of the sky. Here, trapped beneath the earth, even memory felt like a betrayal. The only thing that mattered was the next swing of the pick, the next basket of ore, the next breath. This was a place where human dignity was stripped away piece by piece, where bodies were treated as disposable tools, to be used until they broke and then discarded. The constant looming threat of a cave-in, a sudden tremor in the earth, was a silent, ever-present fear, adding another layer to the profound dread. Days turned into an indistinguishable hell of darkness and toil. Her eyesight began to suffer, eyes straining against the perpetual gloom, seeing only shifting shadows and the dull gleam of the rock. Her skin, once tanned by the sun, became pallid and grey, streaked with dirt and sweat. Her hair was matted, her fingernails broken and caked with grime. She moved like an automaton, her body obeying the commands of the overseer, her mind a numb, empty space where thoughts of escape once resided. This was the goal of the mind punishment, not just to extract wealth from the earth, but to extract every last spark of humanity from the enslaved, to render them utterly incapable of resistance or even independent thought. The contrast with our modern emphasis on mental well-being and the psychological impact of confinement is stark. Here, the mind was merely another tool to be broken. The relentless physical demands, coupled with the profound sensory deprivation, conspired to create a living death, a slow descent into madness. The rhythmic clang of the pick became the soundtrack of her diminishing existence. One day, a dull thud, louder than usual, echoed through the tunnels. A section of the mine had collapsed, trapping several workers. Panic, a raw, primal scream, erupted through the cavern. For a moment the rhythmic clang of picks ceased, replaced by the terrified shouts of the trapped and the desperate calls of those trying to dig them out. She watched, her own heart hammering, as guards, indifferent to the lives lost, merely focused on securing the remaining workers, ensuring no one used the chaos as an opportunity to flee. The incident, a terrifying common occurrence in Roman mines, was a stark reminder of the ultimate fragility of life here, the absolute expendability of a slave. The air grew thick with dust and the scent of pulverized rock, carrying with it the fresh stench of death. This was a place where existence was a constant gamble, where the earth itself was a capricious master and human life was worth less than the ore it yielded. The horror of the moment, the chilling indifference of the guards, sealed her internal prison tighter than any physical chain. Miraculously, she survived the mine, though scarred deeper than any brand. Her escape from that subterranean hell was not a flight to freedom, but a transfer, a new stage of punishment. She was re-enslaved, but under a master known for his extreme cruelty, a man who saw her branded arm not as a sign of ownership, but as a challenge to be met with escalating torment. This was the fourth brutal punishment, re-enslavement under conditions designed to be worse than anything she had known, a descent into a specific personalized hell. Her new home was a sprawling, neglected villa, its grandeur faded, its air thick with an unspoken menace. The master, a corpulent man with eyes like chips of flint, took a perverse pleasure in breaking spirits. He was particularly harsh with women who had shown any form of defiance, seeing their resistance as a personal affront. The other slaves in the villa, their eyes downcast, their movements furtive, gave her a silent warning. The air in this place hummed with suppressed violence, a constant tension that tightened her chest. Her brand, once a mark of public humiliation, now felt like a target, drawing the master's cruel gaze. Here, the constant physical toil of the mill and mine was replaced by a more insidious form of suffering, psychological torment, constant surveillance, and arbitrary, unpredictable cruelty. Her duties were varied and endless, from grinding grain to carrying heavy amphorae to personal service for the master, all performed under the constant threat of a capricious wrath. The lash was never far, but often. The most painful punishments were the psychological ones: public shaming, starvation, or the threat of harming other slaves if she failed to comply. She learned to anticipate his moods, to become invisible, to stifle any flicker of emotion that might draw his attention. This was a world stripped of any predictability, a terrifying dance on the edge of a precipice. The casual, almost routine nature of the cruelty was what truly shattered her. It wasn't born of passion, but of cold, calculating power. This new reality was a profound contrast to the physical hell of the mines, a different kind of darkness, a creeping dread that permeated every waking moment, every furtive glance. She was not merely a slave, she was a plaything for a cruel man's amusement, her spirit his new conquest. The fear became a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach that never truly loosened. Each sunrise brought not the promise of a new day, but the dread of another cycle of torment. Her body, already broken, found new ways to ache, her spirit new depths of despair. The other slaves in the villa, once a source of potential solidarity, were now largely focused on their own survival, wary of each other, careful not to attract the master's ire by associating with a marked fugitiva. This isolation was another layer of punishment, severing her from any sense of community. She ate her meagre meals in silence, her eyes downcast, the food tasteless in her mouth. Sleep was fitful, haunted by nightmares of whips and darkness. This was a life defined by negation. No hope, no joy, no respite, only the stark, brutal reality of her servitude, the casual violence she witnessed. The screams of others served as a constant reminder of her precarious position, her utter lack of protection. The psychological toll was immense, eroding her sense of self, leaving behind a hollow shell of her former being. The very air of the villa felt heavy, saturated with unspoken suffering. One evening, a younger house slave, a mere girl, made a small mistake, spilling a drink. The master's reaction was swift and terrifyingly disproportionate. He ordered her flogged, and worse, ordered the other female slaves, including our protagonist, to witness it, to stand by and watch as the whip cut into the girl's delicate skin. The sounds of the girl's cries, the sickening thud of the lash, ripped through the silent villa, a testament to the master's absolute power. This was a deliberate act of terror, designed to reinforce the futility of resistance and to break the spirits of all who witnessed it. Our protagonist stood, her body rigid, her mind screaming, forced to internalize the horror, knowing that any flicker of defiance on her part would lead to the same fate, or worse. The casual cruelty of the scene, the sheer disregard for human pain, was a chilling reflection of the dark heart of Roman slavery. The air was thick with the girl's anguish, a sound that would haunt her long after the whipping ceased, embedding itself in the deepest corners of her memory. The brutal reality of her situation, the inescapable nature of her fate, began to harden her. The initial despair gave way to a cold, burning resentment, a desperate, silent rage that smouldered deep within her. She moved through the villa like a phantom, her face an unreadable mask, her eyes holding a dangerous, defiant glint that no one seemed to notice. This internal shift, this refusal to be utterly broken, was a dangerous development in a world that demanded absolute submission. It was a silent act of rebellion, a refusal to grant her tormentors the satisfaction of her complete capitulation. But such inner defiance, if detected, would be met with the ultimate final punishment. She heard the whispers of a final fate reserved for the truly intractable, the arena or public execution. This was the fifth and most brutal punishment, a public spectacle designed to provide entertainment alongside a stark, terrifying warning. The thought sent a cold dread through her, yet also a strange, dangerous sense of resolve. If she was to die, it would be on her own terms, in her own defiance. The very dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from a high window seemed to glitter with an ominous knowing. The whispers solidified into certainty. The master, tired of her quiet defiance, her unyielding gaze, decided she was a lost cause, too dangerous to keep. She was to be sold to a gladiatorial school, destined for the arena, or worse, to be executed publicly as a dire warning. The news spread through the villa like wildfire, met with silent dread by the other slaves and a chilling satisfaction by the master. For our modern sensibilities, the idea of turning human suffering into public spectacle is abhorrent, a barbaric relic of a distant past. Yet in Rome, such events were common, a source of entertainment and a powerful tool of social control. Her ultimate fate, therefore, was not merely a personal tragedy, but a carefully orchestrated performance, a final, brutal lesson for anyone who might contemplate the forbidden path of freedom. She heard the preparations, the hushed conversations, the clinking of chains. Her mind, surprisingly, was clear. The fear was still there, a cold current, but beneath it lay a strange calm, a fierce determination. If her life was to end, she would face it with a gaze that reflected her unbroken spirit, a final, silent act of defiance against a system that sought to consume her entirely. The day came quickly, ushered in by the harsh light of dawn. She was led, not through the city's main thoroughfares, but through back alleys, her presence deemed too problematic for a direct route. The chains on her wrists and ankles were heavy, cold, a final, undeniable statement of her status. The air was thick with the smells of the city, familiar yet distant, as if she were viewing it from behind a glass wall. Her escorts were grim-faced, their silence more menacing than any threat. She felt no fear, only a profound weariness and a strange sense of detachment. This was the culmination of her journey, the brutal end to a life defined by struggle. The arena gates loomed ahead, massive wooden structures, scarred and weathered, hinting at the violence within. The roar of the crowd, a distant, hungry sound, seeped through the thick planks, a terrifying lullaby of death. This was the Empire's ultimate statement, that even the most desperate acts of freedom would be met with an absolute, undeniable response, transforming individual suffering into collective entertainment and a chilling warning. The sun high above felt like a judge, casting long, accusing shadows. As she was pushed through the dark, echoing passageways beneath the arena, the roar of the crowd grew deafening, a visceral, animalistic sound that vibrated through the very stone. The smell of blood, sweat, and fear was palpable, a heavy perfume of impending death. She saw the other condemned, mostly men, their faces a mixture of terror and grim resignation. Some were gladiators, others criminals, but all shared the same final destination. Her position, as a woman, was unusual for this specific form of public execution, making her a more potent symbol, a unique cautionary tale. This was her final stage, her last act of defiance, to face death with an unbroken spirit, to deny them the satisfaction of her tears, her pleas. The metal gate before her rose with a groan, revealing the blinding sunlight of the arena floor, the vast expectant crowd and the blood-stained sand. For a split second she looked up, past the tiered seats, past the roaring faces, to the vast indifferent sky, a profound melancholic sigh escaping her lips. This was not merely the end of a life, but the final, brutal punctuation mark on an entire existence defined by the absence of freedom. Stepping onto the sand, the sudden glare of the sun was blinding, momentarily disorienting. The roar of the crowd intensified, a wave of sound crashing over her. She raised her head slowly, deliberately, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, not in fear, but in a final defiant act of presence. She saw their faces, a blur of humanity, some eager for spectacle, some merely curious, others perhaps with a fleeting flicker of pity. But none could truly grasp the journey that had led her to this moment, the depths of despair and the desperate burning hope that had fueled her flight. The guards positioned her in the centre, facing the imperial box where her former master sat, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He had sought to break her, to erase her will, and in his eyes he had succeeded. But as she stood there, defiant in her silence, she knew he hadn't. The physical chains held her, but her spirit remained untamed, a small stubborn flame flickering against the vast darkness of their power. This was her final, profound statement, that even in ultimate defeat, a measure of self could be preserved, a quiet dignity asserted. The executioner approached, his face obscured by a helmet, his movements practiced and efficient. He carried a heavy sword, its blade gleaming dully in the arena sun. The crowd hushed, a collective holding of breath ready for the final act. She did not flinch, did not cry out, did not beg. Her eyes remained fixed, not on the executioner, but on a distant point beyond the arena walls, on the faint hazy outline of the hills she had once tried to reach. In that last suspended moment, she was not a slave, not a runaway, not a branded piece of property. She was simply a woman, reclaiming in her final breath the agency that had been so brutally denied her. The sound of the sword was swift, a clean, sharp hiss through the air, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd. The sun beat down on the blood-stained sand, indifferent to the life that had just extinguished, to the silent, defiant scream that had finally been silenced. And as the dust settled, the echo of her struggle lingered, a faint whisper in the vast indifferent expanse of history, a testament to the unyielding human spirit that dared to dream of freedom, even in the face of the most brutal empire.